Everyone ready?
This is the SEC Insider Hit. Presented by your local Farm Bureau Insurance agent. Go local. Go with a home team.
I think I decided what I want to do with the set as far as helmets. Left side is the losers of the week, and the right side is the winners. But I got to change it up right now.
We have to do that moving forward.
Yeah,
okay.
It's not like I want it right now, but it will be,
Because I think I'd have to look at what Delta State did, but the rest of those teams won this weekend.
I know. So I'm going to grab the A&M helmet and the Florida helmet. Oh, did you see Missouri got embarrassed by Kansas State?
Did anyone see that Missouri lost?
No, they didn't.
Yeah,
Never
no
mind.
one watches
All
that
right.
game.
Out of bounds, ESPN 105.9 The Zone. Our guests join us on the Yuengling Lager guest line. And our SEC Insider Hit this morning is brought to you by Farm Bureau Insurance. Bundle your car and home and save with your local Farm Bureau Insurance agent. We want to bring in Brad Edwards, 25 years at ESPN, college football insider, talk Bama and Texas. Brad Edwards, good morning, buddy.
Good morning, Bo. How is everything, man?
Well, it's going well. It's one of those crazy Mondays where A&M and Nebraska and Notre Dame lose to three G5 teams, and the Bama-Texas game was close and wild, and none of us expected that. So I feel like it's just insanity right now on an SEC football show.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about. And, even Kentucky beating Florida threw some people for a loop just because Florida had looked so good the week before against Utah. And so, yeah, it's funny because, Georgia, clear cut. I have no idea what the coaches are doing once again. We say this almost every year, but how can you keep Alabama at number one in the coaches poll? And you would think, like, if anyone is going to kind of defer to the defending champ until they've lost, it would be the coaches. So why Georgia is still ranked behind Alabama in that poll, don't know. It doesn't matter, fortunately, but Georgia, clearly the best team through 2 weeks of the season, and Alabama's fortunate just to, still be undefeated.
Alabama punted 6 times, straight times, 6 times in a row on Saturday. I don't know when the last time.
At least 4 of them were 3 and outs.
Right.
At least 4, if not 5.
I understand that Texas recruits pretty well, but I can't imagine when the last time Bama punted 6 straight times, maybe the 9-6 game against LSU. But let's start on offense, Brad. How surprised, shocked, not surprised were you to see the offense not click either way until Bryce had to do the heroics late in the game?
So I was surprised. I wouldn't go as far as shocked because what we saw on Saturday was something that we saw in a few games last year. And so it's not like, wow, it's been, a decade since we've seen Alabama do something like that. Now, as you said, 6 straight possessions ending with a punt. Maybe it hadn't quite been that bad, but I know last year, week 2, when they had a 21-0 lead and then just stagnated and then almost lost at Florida, there was something similar to that. I don't know if it was 4 or 5 punts in a row, but I know they had at least 3 straight 3 and outs, and then that's when Florida started to come back. And there were several games last year where they had the same type of offensive issues that we saw against Texas, where receivers just couldn't get open. Pass protection was good enough. Bryce was standing there looking, you could tell he's going through his progression, and there's just nobody to throw to. And so, the other thing is, outside of that 81-yard touchdown run on the second possession of the game, they never really were able to establish the running backs. And that was a big part of it too. And so there was just a whole lot of it that looked like last year's Alabama team. And as bad as that appeared at times, and as much as it was completely unlike what we had seen from Alabama for the previous 5 seasons or so, that team still took the lead into the fourth quarter of the national championship game. So, yeah, I think on one hand you see this and you're like, oh, Alabama's vulnerable, but at the same time we saw them look very vulnerable in like 5 SEC games out of 8 last year, and they still came really close to winning the national title. And so I think with Alabama, just because they've been there and we've seen them just be able to do what it takes, and especially with Bryce Young. I mean, the kid, it's like, I don't know if I speak for the majority of America, but I feel like most people watching that game are just shaking their heads. 'Cause look, I mean, I realize most people want to see Alabama lose.
Sure.
And you're watching Texas and you're thinking they should be up 3 scores right now with not only, the way that Alabama's offense is stagnated, but the way that Alabama's defense is gifting them things with these stupid penalties that are keeping drives alive. And they kept getting into the red zone, but they couldn't score touchdowns. And so I think when Texas finally settled for another field goal to go up 16-10, everyone is like, all right, here's where Alabama just miraculously. And by the way, same thing that happened with the Iron Bowl last year. Auburn had every opportunity to be up by more than 1 score, and they never quite got there, and that's all it took was 1 possession. And so it happened again on Saturday, and it just feels like Bryce Young's just one of those guys, and whenever they need it, they'll finally do it. And so that's why I don't necessarily hit the panic button on Alabama as far as, they're going to lose 3 games this year. I don't know. It just seems like, hey, they might play close games, but that quarterback's just, when he has to, he'll find a way.
Brad Edwards on the Yuengling Lager guest line talking Bama, Texas. Hell of a ball game on Saturday. What does it mean? Agree with Brad. Who knows? But we love to have fun on Monday, breaking it down and seeing what could happen maybe in a few weeks when they go to Fayetteville, which I didn't even think I would say that a couple of weeks ago. If Quinn Ewers plays that whole game, are you and I discussing Bama losing today?
You would think so. I mean, the way the offense was clicking for Texas, but I still come back to what I just said, which is with Bryce Young at quarterback, you just feel like if they had needed to score 40 points, they would have done it. It's like if they had to flip that switch in the third quarter instead of in the fourth, that probably things change. It's just hard to imagine that they would have been blown out by Texas. I don't know. They just maybe psychologically when Ewers went out, there was a little bit of a letdown by Alabama because like, okay, we got this, now we don't have to worry about, keeping up in a track meet and whatever. And they didn't. The crazy thing is at the end of the day, Texas scored 1 touchdown in that game. That was it. 1 touchdown. But yeah, it really is hard not to think that, Bo. Like I get let's just say I roll my eyes a lot when I hear Texas fans going back to that national championship game. If Colt McCoy hadn't been hurt, I mean, Alabama controlled that game in a whole lot of ways that it probably wouldn't have mattered, in my opinion. It would have been a much better game, but I don't think Texas wins. This one, on the other hand, you saw Texas moving the ball very well in Alabama. There was a much larger sample of drives with Quinn Ewers in there. And then when you look at the way Alabama's offense stagnated, it really is difficult to say that it didn't matter at all. And so while I do say maybe it wouldn't have, it's hard not to say at the same time that there's a good chance that it would have. So yeah, I think Alabama was fortunate not only with the Ewers injury, but also with the backup Hudson Card. He took a big hit and was banged up and was out there kind of limping around for pretty much the whole second half. It's funny if you watch that Tennessee game against Pitt, same thing happened with Tennessee. Tennessee knocked out the starting quarterback. The backup comes in, and then he's limping around for most of the second half, and still that team hung in there and took the game all the way to the wire. And so it was strange to see that happen with 2 different SEC teams on the road out of conference, but both of them benefited from injuries to the other team's quarterbacks, and both of them still barely survived.
Are you ready to say that Georgia is a good bit better than Bama, or that is an overreaction? And because Bryce is Bryce, and Bryce Young is one of the best or the best quarterbacks in college football, that over time they'll start to figure it out, and he'll give them an opportunity regardless of who they play?
I'm ready to say that Georgia is clearly better than Alabama right now. Like, 2 weeks into the season, they're clearly better. But that doesn't make any difference because they're not going to play Alabama until December. If they play them at all, that's when it'll be. So it really doesn't matter how much better Georgia is than Bama right now. But they are, and I don't even think there's an argument there. Where I think we're going to learn a lot about Alabama, obviously not this weekend against UL Monroe, but once conference play begins, and I think Bama starts with Vandy, so you're not going to learn anything there. But once they get into, you mentioned Arkansas, I believe Ole Miss comes up, pretty soon in the schedule. There are a few games there where we're going to learn, was that a blip on the radar screen? Because on one hand, you could look at it and you could say, okay, look, Texas has a lot of great athletes. All right, there are a lot of 5-star, high 4-star players on that roster. And just from a pure talent standpoint, you could say, Texas has more talent than an Arkansas or an Ole Miss. They might not be a better team, but they probably have more raw talent. And when you consider that Sark came from Alabama, he knows Alabama's defense. The same defensive coordinator, Pete Golding, and obviously Saban has a big influence in the defense. Sark is probably better equipped than anybody out there, along with, Kiffin's another one, knows what they're doing. Although Kiffin wasn't there with Golding. Sark was there with Golding.
Right.
So you put all that together, and it's like, okay, you got a head coach, a play caller who's very well equipped to know the weaknesses in that defense and how to exploit it. You have Gary Patterson, who is I think he's an analyst technically, but he's on the staff. Gary Patterson is on the staff at Texas, the former TCU head coach, who is a great defensive mind. And he basically, they said on the broadcast, his entire job over the offseason was to game plan for Alabama. And so you got all that stuff together, and it may be a combination of factors. They just caught him at the right day. But that's what we're going to find out, because when Alabama starts SEC play, I would say the first half of the schedule, if they start blowing out people, then I think what we saw on Saturday was an aberration. If Alabama gets taken to the wire a couple more times, then I don't think a whole lot has changed from last year. And that's not only where you start questioning, okay, is Alabama good enough to win the national championship this year? You also would start questioning, okay, has Alabama's program started to slide back to the pack just a little bit? Because on paper, this should be a dominant Alabama team. When you look at the returning experience from last year, the rankings of the recruiting classes that comprise this team, the quality of the players they've gotten out of the transfer portal, this should be a team that just, like so many in recent years, just runs roughshod over the opposition. And if that doesn't happen, that to me would be a big sign that maybe Bama is just starting to lose it just a little bit.
All right. Brad Edwards on the Yuengling Lager guest line, college football insider for 25 years. Yeah, I can't wait to see what happens in a couple of weeks, 3 weeks, I guess it is, when Bama goes to Arkansas. And do they boat race them? Or is this a hell of a ball game in Fayetteville? And is it fun and interesting? Also, you mentioned Gary Patterson, and I think that was a brilliant hire by Sark. Pete Kodkowski, who you've mentioned on the show, and Bartu has too, who's revered as a defensive coordinator, is the DC at Texas. He was amazing at Washington under Chris Peterson. So when you look at that, him and Gary Patterson, you're right, they did a hell of a job against Bama. Which unit do you think can jumpstart and take a big step forward in the next few weeks for Bama? The offense or the defense, Brad?
I think that the Bama defense is good enough. I mean, outside of some issues with their with their corners who were committing pass interference, and some of it was called, some of it wasn't. The defense was pretty stout. I think they're especially difficult to run on, and that's why I kind of question how well Arkansas matches up with them, because it's going to be really tough to run on Alabama. I don't care who you are. It's going to be tough to run on them. And without Treylon Burks, I don't know if the Arkansas passing game, that's how they scored on Alabama last year, was through the air. And they don't have the same weapons they did a year ago. So I think Bama's defense is generally going to be tough to score on. And they've allowed one touchdown through 2 games. The question for me is at receiver. And this may be the first time in, I don't know, since 2007, Saban's first year, that they don't have an eventual NFL first-round pick at receiver on the roster.
Wow.
It's hard to say for sure, but you had Julio Jones I take that back. 2011, when they won the national championship with that dominant defense, they didn't have one. But you had Julio in 8, 9, and 10. Amari Cooper came in 12, so 12, 13, 14. Calvin Ridley came in 15. And then in 17, you had that class with Jerry Jeudy, Devontae Smith, and Henry Ruggs. And then Jalen Waddle came in 18. And then last year, they didn't have one that they had recruited, at least in a signing class, but Jamison Williams came in for 1 year through the transfer portal and was a first-round pick. So they've always had, except for that one season, have always had that guy. I do not see a receiver that scares you on this year's Alabama team. There's some good possession receivers, but there's not the game breaker. And to me, their offense and the progression of their offense really depends on someone emerging who can take the top off the defense. They've got to be able to stretch the field. They've hardly even attempted to go deep in the first 2 games. And I think that guy is either there's a guy named Tyler Harrell who was a transfer in from Louisville, who was a burner. I mean, just total speed guy. And he's been injured and has not played in the first 2 games. He was banged up in August practices and everything. He eventually will get out there. I have no idea whether he's going to beat out those other guys or not. But they need him or either one of these true freshmen to be able to fill that role of the deep threat. Because without a deep threat, I really don't see Alabama being able to have its way offensively with the better defenses on the schedule. And there will be better defenses than Texas, I would think, once they get an SEC play. Certainly Georgia is better when they eventually run to them. So
yeah.
that to me that's the big question for Alabama is receiver.
All right, let's switch gears. Brad Edwards on the Out of Bounds show. I want to talk you just big picture Jimbo Fisher. That is a devastating loss, Brad. They recruit way too well to lose that game to Appalachian State. And I know Appalachian State is a hell of a G5 program going back to Jerry Moore, but it doesn't matter. We're 5 years in. They don't have an answer at QB. Not sure why he didn't go to Max Johnson, but it's easy for me to say from my couch drinking a beer. We all talk about his 25 pages playbook on the sideline. And no one around him is going to challenge him to change, right? Like Saban did it on his own. It's not like Mal Moore or Greg Byrne. Greg wasn't there then. It's not like Mal Moore in his late years walked into Saban's office and told Nick Saban, you have to go get Lane Kiffin and modernize your offense. Saban did that because he's brilliant. We don't believe Jimbo's going to do that. What is your takeaway from where they are now 5 years in?
Right, and that to me is the key, that this is year 5. This isn't, year 2 or 3 where he's still got some of the previous coaches' players. He's been able to form his roster through recruiting. And he came in, and you could say maybe it was unfortunate for him that he inherited a quarterback who had just started the second half of the season as a freshman, Kellen Mond, and he was kind of forced to go with him for a while. But he continued to recruit quarterbacks, and it wasn't like anyone ever beat out Kellen Mond. But Mond was a guy, for all of his talent coming out of high school, all of the high rankings and everything as a recruit, never really improved 3 years under Jimbo. and then you had last year where Haynes King is injured very early in the season. Calzada plays out of his mind against Alabama, but the rest of the season was pretty much garbage. Haynes King looks terrible through 2 games this year. And you and I have talked about this so many times. You know how I feel about Jimbo. It's just that he's a good coach, but he's not a great coach. He's not close to that upper tier that everyone wants to put him in because he's won a national championship. But when A&M hired him, they felt like they were getting one of the best offensive minds in college football.
That's right.
And I've said it many, many times. No one has ever feared the so-called Jimbo Fisher offense. Okay, they feared the Chip Kelly offense at Oregon. They feared the Art Briles offense at Baylor. Nobody has feared the Jimbo Fisher offense, except for maybe that one time. And it wasn't because of the offense. It was because of the talent at Florida State in 2013. But Jimbo's, it starts with a quarterback, and that's what you expected. He had 3 quarterbacks at FSU who were drafted in the first round. 2 of them probably shouldn't have been, but they were. And so that was his reputation. He's going to groom a quarterback. He's going to develop these guys. And he's had 3 different quarterbacks now at A&M and nothing. And, you mentioned how devastating the App State loss is. I mean, that's because you're coming off of this number 1 recruiting class. And you know this as well as anybody. You are not going to reach the level of Georgia and Alabama, talent-wise, with 1 recruiting class. You're going to have to do that 3 times in a row to get to their level. And you're not going to be able to repeat that if recruits aren't seeing results on the field. And, they lost 4 conference games last year. They went 2-4 against the West. A lot of people don't realize that because you remember them beating Alabama. They beat Alabama and Auburn. They lost to everybody else in the West last year. So they were 2-4 against their division a year ago. Now they lose to App State. They're probably going to lose to Miami. This is a huge game coming up on Saturday because for A&M, if they can beat Miami, it doesn't completely offset the loss to App State, but it certainly changes the mindset and it allows them to kind of go into conference play in a more, positive mindset, and it fixes some of that. But if they lose to Miami, no one was imagining that they could possibly lose 2 non-conference games, already have 2 losses, and basically be out of the playoff picture before conference play even began, which is what they're staring at if this happens. And if they don't get any better than what we've seen through 2 weeks, their best case is probably 4-4 in conference play again. So, I mean, you're talking about 6-6.
Good hell. All right, Brad, I got to jump in. I've got about 50 seconds. Tell our listeners about your podcast.
Yeah, so I've got a new podcast. We're covering the SEC, just getting cranked up. I'm doing it on Saturday nights with Tyler Bray, former Tennessee quarterback. We're going through all the games, and those get posted on Sunday. I'm also doing it on Tuesday and Thursday. So the podcast is called Fourth and Manageable. If people want to check it out, wherever you get your podcast, you should be able to find it there.
Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Fourth and Manageable. Brad Edwards on the Yuengling Lager guest line. Thank you, Brad Edwards. Bama with the win, A&M with the loss. Now A&M will host Miami, and they lost game day. Game day is going to Appalachian State. We'll have the Bank Plus Player of the Week at 9:15, and Olin Buchanan, Texas A&M Insider, at 9:30.